and best measures of what's happening is the retail sector. And year on year, the retail sector, spending in the retail sector is down by 3.5%, which actually isn't great news. But that's directly related to the fall of disposable incomes. And that's at its lowest level for decades. So things are more expensive and we have less money with which to buy them. And so our purchasing decisions are being made much more carefully. And then when we look at the average pay rises, well, around 2% average in the private sector. So we're still seeing pay increases, pay rises, but well below the rate of inflation, and so therefore not keeping up with the cost of living. So there's pressure, I think, on employers at least to give something. We've moved away from pay freezes, which were quite prevalent in the last couple of years, into seeing something actually going into people's pay, but not enough to keep up with the cost of living. The public sector clearly is a really important factor because there's so much change going on in the public sector. We're reaching the end of the public sector financial year, and lots and lots of cost reduction is going to happen in the forthcoming year and years, with the government setting out a target to cut spending by 95 billion over 5 years. And lots of that is going to be around headcount reduction. But it's going to hit private sector suppliers and employees really hard. And basically there will be less money around. And so what happens in the public sector has a real spin-over into what happens in the private sector. There's a huge amount of connection. And I'm not sure that we've seen the most or the impact of any of these public sector cuts yet. There's been the TUC march on the streets where people were protesting about the cuts, but actually all of that stuff isn't going to change the fact that they're still looking to take out 95 billion over 5 years. Because if you listen to the government, they will say that there's no choice. They're not using the language of compromise. I think one of the other things that's making times quite so difficult is the fact that there's increased employee awareness. You know, this kind of thing around individuals knowing their rights now. And they know their rights. They're much more educated. They know their rights because workplace technology, i.e. access to the internet and access to information is pretty instant. And they're able to get messages around to each other pretty quickly, if not instantaneously, through social networking. And so what we have is employees, groups of employees who are much more informed around what they can and can't do and what employers can and can't do towards them, whether there's a union involved or not. And I think that's making things more challenging for employers who want to do things, who want to make changes, who need to find efficiencies, and coming up against groups of employees who are far more clued up in terms of probably being able to be more awkward. And then lastly, if we look at the trade union platform and what's going on, sorry, second to last, trade unions are definitely in survival mode. The membership now in the UK is 25%. It seems to fall steadily by 1% per year. And it's an issue for them because they can't recruit new members. And so their traditional heartlands of the public sector is holding strong, but with the decimation of public sector jobs, their numbers are going to fall even further. So unions are in a tight spot, actually, and they've got to find a way to be able to attract the younger workers in the private sector into union membership. So 25% of the workforce are unionized, and 16% of private sector employees belong to a union, and about 45% of public sector. If you contrast that with some of the other European countries, actually they're still quite high. France is lower than us. The only places that tend to be higher is Scandinavia, where trade unions have higher membership numbers. But so the UK, it's in decline, and the unions have got to do something about that. And I think that the unions were fairly excited when the Conservatives were elected, and then probably less excited when it was a coalition, because they were probably sharpening their their weaponry in order to have a fight with the old enemy, because clearly unions and the Conservative Party don't meet at minds and have the same ideologies. But I think the unions have been a little bit disappointed that the Tories haven't been quite so anti-union. And in fact, when you look at what's been going on in the private sector, they've talked the language of engagements rather than confrontation. And there's been some quite good deals done on some of the public sector compensation schemes around redundancy. I think with only one of the public sector unions not making agreements with the government. So actually even that kind of landscape has changed somewhat. But the trade union platform will always be quite dominant, particularly obviously in unionised workplaces. And then lastly, I think times are difficult because of the increasing globalisation of business. We see more globalisation, more multinational employers taking a global approach, trying to reach cost reduction through global activity, through global initiatives, and being vulnerable actually around the corporate social responsibility agenda, particularly for global union alliances, which I'll talk about a little bit more, but some businesses have been under increased scrutiny who have got operations globally around their CSR agenda, and it can be quite a weakness. And I think that adds actually to the dimension of making times quite so difficult in employee relations terms. So that's a little bit about the background. If we look at what kind of impact that has on employers, well, we've seen definitely an increase in union activity. So the private sector unions are trying, Unite in particular, to be more attractive to non-members, but also they are upping the ante in terms of their workplace activity. And certainly some of the people that I work with who have unions and 25–30% representation across the workforce actually are spending 80% of their time managing the union, and it's hugely disproportionate. And that's as a direct result of increased union activity in workplaces. Certainly seeing that workforces are becoming less productive as a result of feeling vulnerable as a result of the changes that are going on wholesale, and it does seem to be impacting on morale and productivity. And so employers are having to find ways to try and engage with employees, probably working them harder for less, but nevertheless trying to engage with them and trying to deal with issues around productivity and morale. There's definitely a greater need for engagement with the workforce, and I'm seeing that employers are getting much better at having engagement strategies in place and seeing the need to engage with the workforce that they've currently got, not just through sticking out a newsletter, but proper strategic engagement strategies that see them through the next 24 to 36 months. Definitely seeing an increase in grievances, so people are not being able to move jobs, they're staying put, but they're staying put and being unhappier. And so the grievance culture in some areas, particularly some of the ex-nationalised employers, some of the rail operators, etc., there's definitely been an increase in grievances, and that shows no sign of slowing down. So, and it comes back to that thing where people know their rights. You end up having a conversation with someone which might start off as being just a conversation around performance, and it ends up in a grievance because someone's affronted that they've dared to have been challenged. Much more pressure to find efficiencies throughout all organisations. But I think senior management boards are getting much tougher in this area, and that has an impact probably to most people on this call, because you are the ones that have to deliver these efficiencies, and so that's becoming tough. And then I think the other thing which is significant for employers is, against all of that, is how do you retain the talent that you need in order for the organisation not to falter? Because there's always a battle for top talent, and there's always a market for good people, and employers having a good strategy in place to be able to retain their top talent is really important. And actually it's an area which can be neglected but it's an expensive place to then have to start trying to pull people in. It's an expensive piece of neglect, actually. So those are some of the kind of impacts that we're seeing on employers. And I think these will be there for a few years to come. So in terms of strategy, well, these are my pointers really as to what it is that you should be thinking about. So at the heart of all this is any organisation, whether they're unionised or non-unionised, that employs people needs to have an ER strategy. And that needs to be, well, what do you want it to do and who's going to do it? So at a very basic level, I mentioned earlier, let's take a unionised example, where the organisation is disproportionate in terms of the amount of time it's spending on managing the unions, even though there's a 25, I think it's actually as low as 22% representation. So the union only represents 22% of the staff, and yet the HRD is spending 80% of the time on union matters. So in that case, one of the strategic decisions is, well, how do you spend less time on the union and more time talking to the non-unionised people, because there's a whole swathe of those guys. But so coming up with the employee relations strategy, which is appropriate to your organisation and what your organisation is trying to do, whether unionised or non-unionised, is absolutely vital. And it needs to enable the wider business objectives too. So it doesn't just sit on its own. It's not a standalone strategy. It sits alongside the HR strategy and the wider business strategy. It should be an enabler. And it's absolutely crucial that senior management are bought into it, because you can have a strategy that says, well, we're going to directly engage with all of our employees and we're going to make sure that the behaviours that we want adopt that, i.e. managers will engage with their employees regularly and tell them what's going on, so our engagement goes up. And if senior management walk around and undermine that, then it's got absolutely no chance whatsoever of getting off the ground or having any impact. And so from the chief executive down, every person in senior management, middle management and junior management then has to support that strategy, and they have to walk and talk it, because if they don't, it will get severely undermined, and there's absolutely no point. Management capability is really, really important, and in my experience, employee relations is actually conducted in local management. So you can set the strategy, but the day-to-day good employee relations happens between local management and their people and their representatives, if there are any. In London Underground, there was some pretty vociferous unions, as probably most people know, and the corporate unions had a particular line, but actually the industrial relations and the employee relations on a day-to-day basis used to take place in the individual depots through the relationships that had been built up with between the manager and the local representatives. And that's the case wherever. If line management are not equipped to be able to deal with and talk to their employees in a proper way, explain the behaviours that the organisation needs, then employee relations will always be an issue. So invest in management capability. Flowing from the employee relations strategy, you should be able to then define exactly what it is that you want from your manager.